It was a typical morning in Iowa, a state known for its peaceful farmlands and wide open spaces. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting its warm, golden light across the endless sea of cornfields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The wind was light, carrying the fresh scent of earth and dew. Everything seemed as it should be in this rural town, quiet, simple, and steady. Farmers could be seen working on their land, the rhythmic sound of their tractors humming through the fields. Nearby, children began to gather at the bus stop, their laughter and chatter filling the crisp air as they prepared for another day of school. In this small town, there was a sense of calm that made the days feel like they would go on forever. There was no rush, no stress, just the steady, unchanging pace of life. People greeted each other with a wave or a smile as they passed on the dirt roads. In fact, there was a sense of timelessness to the town, as if nothing ever really changed here. Life seemed to slow down, and the biggest excitement most people had was deciding what to have for dinner or which movie to watch on a Saturday night. But that morning, as the day unfolded, something was different. It was subtle at first, a feeling in the air that was hard to place, like a shift in the atmosphere that only a few people seemed to notice. For some, it was the breeze that didn't feel quite right. It was cooler than it should have been for a summer morning, almost unnaturally so. For others, it was the silence. The usual chorus of birds and insects was missing. There was no hum of cicadas, no chatter from the squirrels in the trees. It was as if the very world had paused for just a brief moment, holding its breath. Even the children at the bus stop seemed to notice the change. They fidgeted with their backpacks, their faces a little more serious than usual, as if they too could feel something lurking just beyond their understanding. But no one spoke of it, and life went on. People went about their routines, convincing themselves that it was just a passing moment, a fleeting oddity that would be forgotten by the end of the day. After all, things like this happened from time to time, didn't they? A sudden gust of wind, a shift in temperature. It was nothing to be concerned about. But as the day wore on, it became clear that this was no ordinary morning. The strange chill lingered in the air, and by noon, it was as if the world had been wrapped in a blanket of unease. The sun, which had risen so warmly earlier, began to feel distant, almost absent. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that the real oddity became apparent. People, whether they were working in their gardens or sitting on their front porches, noticed that the sky had grown dim. The sun seemed to be setting far too early. The warm golden light replaced by a harsh, unnatural gray. It wasn't the kind of sunset that you would expect in Iowa, where the skies usually put on a magnificent show of colors at dusk. Instead, the light seemed to fade, quickly and without warning, as though the sun was fleeing from something. At first, people thought it might just be the weather. Maybe a storm was approaching, though there hadn't been any reports of it. But there was something unsettling about the way the daylight was disappearing. The way it felt like the world was being swallowed whole. As the evening dragged on, the sky grew darker, unnaturally so, and a strange quiet settled over the town. Even the winds, which had been gentle in the morning, had stopped. The birds that had been so silent earlier in the day seemed to vanish altogether. The only sound was the distant rustle of the trees, and that seemed muffled, as if the air itself. Inside homes, people began to talk. They gathered in living rooms, peering out of windows and exchanging nervous glances. It was hard to put into words, but everyone felt it. The sense that something was wrong. Something far more serious than just an odd change in the weather. But what could it be? It was too soon to say. No one had any idea that this eerie calm was just the beginning, that it marked the start of something none of them were prepared for. As night fell and the sun disappeared completely, the first signs of trouble began to show. The power went out across town, not in isolated pockets, but in one fell swoop. Homes plunged into darkness, the streetlights flickering before going completely black. The only light left came from the faint glow of street. At the local diner, a few patrons had begun to notice something else. The normally chatty waitresses and cooks were unnaturally quiet. They moved with a sense of purpose that seemed forced, as if they were trying to avoid eye contact, or worse, trying to avoid something that they could not name. The usual chatter of patrons had fallen silent, replaced by the clinking of silverware and the low murmur of concerned voices. Out on the roads, headlights pierced the darkness, but they revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Just empty streets and quiet homes. But there was no denying that something wasn't right. The air was thick with tension, the heavy silence broken only by the sound of a distant dog barking, a sound that seemed strangely hollow in the stillness of the night. The town, which had always been filled with the sounds of life and laughter, was eerily silent. Even the dogs had stopped barking. People began to lock their doors and windows, pulling the blinds shut with an urgency they didn't fully understand. It wasn't fear, at least not yet. It was something deeper, something primal, a warning that their peaceful town was about to be shaken to its very core. They didn't know it, but the last peaceful night they would ever have had already begun. For the next few hours, the town of Iowa would hold its breath, waiting for something terrible, something beyond comprehension to come. It would be the calm before the storm, the brief, fleeting moment before everything changed forever. And when the storm did come, it would arrive with a force that no one in the quiet town of Iowa could have possibly imagined. The events began quietly enough, as odd things often do, unnoticed by most at first, and dismissed by those who did. It started with strange sounds coming from the woods just outside of town. At first, it was a whisper, a rustle in the trees that farmers tried to shrug off as the wind. A particularly cold breeze, perhaps, or the normal creaking of branches in the night. But the sound seemed too purposeful, too deliberate. It was the sound of movement in the brush. Something unnatural, something deliberate. And the whispers, they didn't sound like wind at all. They were far too distinct, too clear. Farmers would listen, sometimes standing in the open fields, feeling a cold chill crawl up their spines as the sounds grew louder. At night, when they were finishing their late work or preparing to turn in for the night, they could hear it from the trees. Footsteps that seemed too heavy for a deer or a bear, too slow and calculated, as though something or someone was moving closer, hiding in the woods, watching them. At first, they wrote it off as just the unfamiliar sounds of the forest. But deep down, they knew something wasn't right. It felt like something was lurking in the darkness. Still, no one dared investigate too closely. It was easier to tell themselves it was the wind, or maybe some nocturnal animal they had never encountered before. But the warning signs were there, lingering like a storm on the horizon. Only no one had the courage to name it. Jim was a quiet man, tough and strong as an ox, the type of person you'd expect to survive anything. His family had lived in the area for generations. He knew these woods like the back of his hand. So, when Jim didn't return that evening, His wife and kids thought it was nothing more than him staying out late for one reason or another. Maybe he'd gotten caught up in a good hunt, or maybe he'd found something interesting in the woods. But as the hours passed and night turned to morning, they began to worry. By midday, Jim's truck was found, parked at the edge of the woods with the door wide open. His rifle was lying in the grass next to the truck, the barrel pointing toward the ground as if it had been carelessly discarded. No sign of Jim, no sound of a struggle, just the eerie emptiness of the woods surrounding the truck. His hat was lying nearby, stained with what looked like blood. But there was no body, just the hat, the rifle, and a trail of blood leading into the woods. The authorities were notified, but no one dared venture deep into the woods. A search party was organized, but the woods were thick and the search was slow. Hours passed, then days. Jim's disappearance was the talk of the town, but no one had any answers. All they knew was that he had vanished without a trace. The whispers, those strange noises, began again after Jim's disappearance. But this time, they were louder, closer. Now people were listening. Now they were afraid. The next day, it happened again. A few more people went missing. At first, it was just the elderly, people who were known to wander off in their old age. Then the young, the ones who worked the land, farmers, laborers, and even children. They simply disappeared. The town grew quieter. People became more cautious, locking their doors earlier, walking in groups, not daring to go out at night. But even with all the caution, people still went missing. Every time someone would disappear, there would be a search, and then nothing. No trace of the missing. No sign of struggle. Nothing but the eerie silence of the woods. It wasn't until the bodies started showing up that the town truly began to panic. They weren't the bodies of the missing, not right away. No, the first few bodies that were found were different. They were twisted, their limbs contorted at unnatural angles, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer terror. They were mangled beyond recognition, some with chunks of flesh missing, others with bite marks and scratches that didn't make sense. The blood was still fresh, the wounds deep. It was as though the body had been torn apart by something with an incredible amount of strength. The bodies were found in the woods, in the fields, in the streets. The terror spread quickly. Whispers filled the air, each person asking the same question: what in the world was happening? These weren't accidents. This wasn't just a string of strange disappearances or a series of unfortunate. Rumors began to spread like wildfire. though no one dared say it out loud. Could it be zombies? Was this the work of the undead? The word felt foreign in their mouths, and most people dismissed it as superstition. But as the days passed and more bodies appeared, the truth became undeniable. The wounds, the disfigurement, the blood. It wasn't human. The town had become ground zero for something much more sinister than anyone had ever imagined. The first group of survivors made their way to the sheriff's office, terrified and shaken. They told their stories in fragmented bursts, speaking over one another, their faces pale and sweaty. "It's them, Sheriff. The things in the woods. We heard them and we saw them. They're not human. They came out of the trees. They just attacked, tearing people apart." But the sheriff didn't know what to make of their stories. He'd heard of strange things happening in far-off places, but this was Iowa. This kind of thing didn't happen here. Still, as more bodies were found, as the terror grew, the sheriff knew something had to be done. The town couldn't ignore it anymore. Something dark, something evil, was spreading in their quiet little corner of the world. In the coming days, more and more people started to panic. They shut themselves in their homes, barricaded doors and windows, and hoped that whatever it was would just go away. But deep down, everyone knew this wasn't something that could be wished away. Whatever had come to Iowa was not going to stop. And the town, once peaceful and serene, was now on the brink of collapse. The fear was palpable in the air, thick and suffocating. It wasn't long before people began to realize that Iowa's deepest fear was no longer a legend or a story whispered around campfires. It was real, and it was coming for them, and there was no escape. It had been a quiet morning in town, the sun rising lazily over the cornfields and casting long shadows across the streets. People were going about their business, oblivious to the growing horror that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, creeping closer. The strange noises from the woods had been dismissed by most, written off as the wind or some wild animal, and the disappearances, though unsettling, had not yet reached the level of panic. But that morning, everything changed. It started with a single figure stumbling out of the woods, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on broken strings. At first, people thought it was someone in a costume, maybe a prankster or an early Halloween enthusiast. The creature's clothes were ragged, its face partially obscured by dirt and decay. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over bones, and there were patches where the flesh had rotted away. Its eyes were hollow and lifeless, a dull, cloudy color, but they gleamed with an almost unnatural hunger.
A few people turned their heads as it wandered aimlessly down the road, not knowing what to make of it. A couple of kids giggled, pointing at what they thought was a well-executed Halloween costume. But then it came closer, its footsteps dragging heavily across the ground. People froze in place. There was something off about the way it moved. Something wrong.
It wasn't just the decay, the grotesque appearance. It was the way it stumbled, the way it seemed to focus on its surroundings, like it was searching for something or someone. No one knew what it was at first, but the moment it let out a low, guttural groan, everything changed. The first victim was Thomas, the town's sheriff. He had been walking toward the creature, his brow furrowed in confusion. He didn't recognize what it was. He thought it was just some drunk who had wandered off into the woods. But when he was within arm's reach, the creature's movements became violent. It lunged at him with a speed no one expected, its hands gripping his shoulders like iron. It was strong, far too strong for any human to possess. Thomas tried to push it off, but the creature's grip was unyielding. It let out a growl, a sickening sound that seemed to reverberate through the very air. Before Thomas could react, the thing bit into his neck. The force of the attack sent a shock of pain through him, but he couldn't even scream. His body went cold as the creature's teeth sank deep into the soft flesh of his throat. The blood spilled out in torrents, staining the creature's filthy hands and the ground beneath them. Thomas flailed, trying to push it away, but his strength was fading fast. The creature didn't stop. It tore into him with a relentless ferocity, biting and gnawing at his flesh like an animal driven by an insatiable hunger. The townspeople stood frozen in shock. Some screamed, others just stared in horror, unable to comprehend what was happening. The sound of bones crunching, of flesh tearing, filled the air, but no one could move. When the sheriff's lifeless body crumpled to the ground, the creature didn't stop. It lifted its head, its cloudy eyes locking onto another victim, another person to satisfy its insatiable hunger. It began staggering toward them with a slow, unsteady gait, dragging its feet across the ground, its hands reaching out like claws. People panicked. Screams erupted from every direction as the townspeople turned and ran, desperate to escape the creature's path. It wasn't just one of them. There were more. Figures began to emerge from the woods, all of them stumbling, all of them with the same decayed appearance, the same hunger in their eyes. The town, once a quiet, peaceful place, had turned into a battleground in the blink of an eye. One after another, the creatures emerged, their movements clumsy and slow, but their intent clear. They weren't interested in anything other than blood. The town's peaceful streets, the places where people had spent their whole lives, became an arena for chaos. The ground was littered with bodies as the creatures tore into the living with savage abandon. The people who hadn't run fast enough were the first to be taken. Screams filled the air as the undead closed in, their twisted forms closing the distance in an instant. The town was no longer a place of safety. It was a hunting ground. The living were hunted, their cries for help drowned out by the deafening noise of panic and the relentless groans of the creatures. Some tried to fight back, but it was hopeless. Guns fired, but the creatures didn't stop. They kept coming. They didn't feel pain. They didn't tire. They just kept coming. One woman, Angela, grabbed a frying pan and swung it at the nearest zombie. She hit it square in the face, knocking it back a few steps. But the creature didn't fall. It simply let out a low growl and lunged at her again. She tried to swing the pan again, but it was too late. The creature was on her, its sharp teeth sinking into her arm as she screamed in agony. She kicked and fought, but it was no use. Within moments, she was gone, her body consumed by the thing that had once been human. As the town descended into chaos, the survivors did the only thing they could think to do: run. They ran for their lives, desperately searching for safety, for a place to hide. But everywhere they turned, there were more of them, more of the undead, stumbling out of the woods, emerging from the shadows, coming from the streets. The town that had once been so full of life was now a ghost town, overrun by creatures that were once people. The air was thick with fear, the streets littered with debris, and the sound of death echoed through the town. The creatures didn't care who they attacked, who they consumed. They were unstoppable, relentless. And the survivors, the few who managed to escape, could only look on in horror as their town was consumed by the very thing they had only heard of in stories. It wasn't just the dead rising. It was the end of everything they knew. The town of Iowa had been swallowed whole by the nightmare that had come to life, and there was no turning back. As night fell over the town, the streets, which had once been so quiet and peaceful, had transformed into something unrecognizable. The familiar sounds of evening settled into chaos. There were screams, the unmistakable crackle of gunfire, and the low, guttural groans of the undead as they shuffled and dragged their decaying bodies across the streets. It was a nightmare, something out of a movie, but it was real. Too real. The streets were no longer safe. The people, who once greeted each other with smiles and waves, were now running for their lives, hiding behind anything they could find, barricading themselves into homes and buildings that offered no guarantees of safety. People were being turned, those closest to them, their neighbors, their family members, their friends. The disease that turned humans into mindless monsters spread rapidly. It didn't care who they were or how much they meant to the people around them. 1 minute, you were talking to someone you loved, and the next, you were staring into the empty, bloodshot eyes of a creature that wanted nothing more than to tear you apart. Families were torn apart in an instant. Parents watched in horror as their children fell victim to the sickness, their once innocent faces twisting into something monstrous. Husbands and wives who had spent years together had to make the unimaginable decision to put an end to the torment and pain of their spouses who had been transformed. A single moment, and the people they loved were lost. The sounds of gunshots echoed through the town, but they didn't seem to help. The shots rang out in desperate attempts to put down the creatures, but it was clear now that the undead were not the same as any enemy the town had faced before. They were relentless, driven by a hunger that could never be sated. Nothing could stop them. Nothing could end their assault. In the old schoolhouse, a group of survivors had gathered, taking shelter as best they could. The doors were barricaded with anything they could find. Chairs, tables, whatever. The survivors sat huddled in the dimly lit room, some of them holding weapons, others clutching makeshift tools like metal pipes and broken bottles. Everyone was on edge, eyes darting nervously toward the windows, listening to every creak and groan of the building. They tried to talk, to make sense of what was happening, but no one had any answers. No one knew how this had started, and worse still, no one knew how to stop it. There was no cure, no magical solution. All they had were their fear and their desperation. The weight of the unknown hung heavy in the air. The tension was palpable. Everyone had a theory. Some people thought it was some kind of virus. Others thought it was the work of dark magic or some curse. But none of it made any sense. How could something like this happen? Why was it happening? And why were they the ones to have to face it? The questions swirled around the room, but no one had any answers. The survivors didn't know who to trust anymore. Everyone was scared. Everyone was desperate. They had been through hell, and yet the worst was still to come. Outside, the groaning of the undead grew louder, more constant, like a low hum that seemed to vibrate in the bones of the living. The creatures were everywhere now, coming from the fields, from the woods, from the rivers, seemingly emerging from every corner of the earth. There was no escaping them. They moved like an endless tide, dragging themselves toward the town with no clear direction, but always with the same goal: to feed. In the darkness, it was hard to know who was alive
and who had already turned. Some of the survivors feared the worst. How long before the people around them would start showing the same signs as those who had already fallen? How long before they too were transformed? Fear of the undead was now matched by fear of each other. No one knew if the person sitting next to them was truly human anymore. No one could be trusted.
The lines between sanity and madness began to blur. The panic was starting to set in. People began arguing, shouting at one another, accusing each other of things they couldn't prove. In the darkness, it felt like everyone was out for themselves. How could they not be? What else was there to hold on to? The bonds that had once united them as a community were unraveling. And soon, the survivors were nothing more than scared strangers. Each of them desperately trying to figure out how to survive. The air inside the schoolhouse was thick with tension. Some survivors tried to keep the peace, whispering reassurances, but their voices were shaky and hollow. The fear was too much to bear. Others couldn't handle it anymore and started screaming at the walls, accusing the dead of coming for them, of hunting them down. One man, in a fit of panic, bolted for the door, screaming that he needed to leave, that he couldn't stay there another second. He was stopped by a group of survivors who tried to restrain him, but it was too late. As he struggled, the door was knocked loose, and the sound of his screams was quickly drowned out by the growing chorus of the undead outside. The door had been breached. The schoolhouse was no longer safe. The survivors panicked. They scrambled to close the door again, but it was no use. The creatures were too many, and they were too close. The town was lost. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. The madness was consuming everything. What had once been a tight-knit community, a place where people had lived and loved and laughed, was now nothing more than a battleground, a place where the dead outnumbered the living, and no one knew who would survive until morning. The survivors were no longer just fighting the undead. They were fighting their own fear, their own panic, and the madness that was spreading through the town faster than the creatures could ever hope to. There was no reason, no explanation, no hope, only terror and despair. And the worst part? No one knew how it would end. The survivors huddled together, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion, as Grandpa Joe slowly spoke, his voice trembling but resolute. The wind howled outside the schoolhouse, carrying with it the distant groans and growls of the creatures that had long since taken over the town. The barricades were holding for now, but everyone knew it wouldn't be long before the undead found their way in, and then it would all be over. Grandpa Joe had always been considered a bit of an eccentric by the townspeople. His long white beard and the twinkle in his eyes had earned him a reputation as a storyteller, someone who enjoyed weaving tales of the old days and forgotten legends. Most people just listened politely, nodding and chuckling at his wild stories, but none of them ever took him seriously. After all, he was just an old man with too much time on his hands, spinning stories to pass the days away. But now, with the town in ruins and death lurking at every corner, his words carried a weight that none of them had anticipated. He sat in the corner of the room, his weathered hands trembling as he clutched a wooden cane, his eyes distant, as if seeing something that none of the others could. The survivors, some of them still in shock from what they had witnessed, leaned in, straining to hear the old man's words.
Many years ago, Grandpa Joe began, his voice growing softer with each word. Before any of you were born, before Iowa was even a town, there was a group of settlers who came here looking for a new home. They were hopeful, ambitious, thinking they had found the perfect land. The soil was rich, the land fertile, and they believed they could start fresh. They were just like any other group of pioneers, working hard to carve out a life for themselves in the wild frontier. But they didn't know what they were walking into. He paused, his eyes clouded with memories of a time long past. The survivors listened intently, the room falling silent, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for the next part of the story.
They disturbed something, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Something that had been buried beneath the earth for centuries. Something ancient and dark. The settlers didn't know it, but the land they had chosen was cursed. Cursed by an old evil that had been lying dormant for as long as the earth had been turning. It wasn't a curse they could see, but it was there, buried, deep, waiting for the wrong people to awaken it. The survivors exchanged nervous glances, the weight of Grandpa Joe's words settling over them. No one spoke. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with tension. They had all heard rumors about the land's history, about strange things that had happened in the early days of the town, but no one had ever paid much attention to them. The settlers, Grandpa Joe went on, his voice growing heavier. They didn't know what they were dealing with. They thought they could handle it,
that they could tame the land and make it their own. But they couldn't. The first undead rose that night, right from the ground, their bodies twisted and decayed, as if the earth itself had rejected them. The settlers fought back, of course. They tried everything they could. Fire, blades, whatever weapons they had. But nothing worked. They couldn't kill what was already dead.
Grandpa Joe's face grew somber, his hands clenching around his cane. They couldn't kill them. They couldn't even stop them. The creatures kept coming, one after another, like a flood of death that wouldn't stop until it had consumed everything in its path. The settlers were forced to flee. They abandoned their homes, left everything behind, and ran from the very land they had hoped to settle. But it was too late. The curse had already been unleashed. The undead had spread, and the land had become forever tainted. A chill ran down the spines of the survivors as Grandpa Joe's words settled in. It was hard to believe what he was saying. It seemed like something from an old horror story, a fairy tale meant to frighten children. But now, in the midst of the nightmare they were living through, his story felt all too real. The creatures they had been fighting, the relentless, unstoppable undead. Was it possible? The curse didn't end with the settlers. Grandpa Joe continued, his voice growing faint. No, it passed on, from generation to generation. It lay dormant for years, waiting for the right time to wake up again. The land kept its secret, hiding the truth beneath the surface. But it was always there, buried deep. And now, it has returned. This town, it's not just bad luck. This is what happens when the curse is awakened. The undead rise once more, and they'll keep coming until there's nothing left. They'll keep coming because they can't be stopped. They're not just creatures. They're the manifestation of the curse itself. Grandpa Joe's eyes locked with those of the survivors, his gaze heavy with the weight of the truth he had just revealed. I tried to warn you all, he whispered. A heavy silence hung in the room as Grandpa Joe's words sunk in. The survivors sat in stunned silence, unable to fully comprehend what they had just heard. The terror they had been experiencing, the horror they had witnessed. Was it all tied to some ancient curse, something beyond their understanding? Was there any way to stop it? Or were they doomed to become the next victims of this relentless nightmare? Grandpa Joe's warning had come too late. The creatures were already here, and they were everywhere. The survivors had hoped for an answer, some kind of solution that could help them survive. But what they had learned instead was that this was no ordinary disaster. This wasn't just a random outbreak. It was something much darker, much more insidious. And knowing the truth didn't change anything. It didn't stop the undead from coming.
didn't stop the madness that was spreading through the town. The curse was real.
As the survivors sat in the dark, the groans of the undead grew louder outside. The pounding on the barricades had begun again. This time, more insistent. The creatures were closing in. The survivors knew what they had to do, but they also knew that there was no escape. The curse was here, and it was consuming everything in its path. The last group of survivors stood together in the ruins of what had once been a town full of life. Their faces were gaunt from fear and exhaustion, their eyes hollow from the horrors they had witnessed. The town, now consumed by silence, felt like a hollow shell of what it had been. The once bustling streets were empty, save for the groans and growls of the undead that now roamed freely, prowling like animals in search of their next victim. The survivors had made their choice. They weren't going to run anymore. They had gathered what weapons they could, whatever they had managed to scrounge together in the chaos. A few had pistols, others had rifles, but most carried makeshift weapons, sharpened sticks, metal pipes, and broken glass. It didn't matter what they had. What mattered now was their will to fight, their need to stand and face the creatures that had torn apart their lives. There was no more hope of escape. There was no more hope of survival. They knew that. But in the end, it didn't matter. They would go down fighting. That was the only thing left for them. The plan was simple. They would make their way to the center of town, where the creatures had gathered in overwhelming numbers. The survivors knew it would be a suicide mission, but they had to try. They couldn't let the undead continue to roam, to spread, to take everything they had once known. The silence that had settled over the town was more than just a lack of noise. It was a prelude to death. The creatures were closing in, and they knew the survivors were the last of the living. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. As they moved through the streets, they could feel the weight of the town's history pressing down on them. They passed houses that had once been homes, their windows shattered, doors torn off their hinges. The roads, once familiar, now seemed alien, overrun with the decay of the undead and the remnants of the lives that had once thrived here. Every step they took was a reminder that the world they had known was no longer theirs. Everything had changed, and now it was all slipping away, piece by piece. The first wave of zombies appeared from the shadows, their decayed bodies dragging themselves forward, moving with an eerie, almost mechanical determination. The survivors opened fire, the sound of gunshots echoing through the silent streets. But the creatures didn't stop. They didn't flinch. They just kept coming, stumbling forward with the same mindless hunger that had driven them from the moment they were born, from the earth itself. It was as though they were driven by something more than just the need to feed. The survivors pushed forward, their weapons raised, their hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. But with each step, they realized something terrifying. The creatures weren't just attacking to feed. They weren't just after flesh. No, there was something deeper, something more sinister at work. It wasn't about hunger. It wasn't just about destruction. They were after something more. Something rooted in the very land itself. Something tied to the curse that had been unleashed upon them. The survivors could feel it. The creatures were coming for them, yes, but they were also coming for the last remnants of life, the last of the living, trying to drag them down into the same darkness that had claimed everything else.
It was as if the undead were part of the land itself, as if the curse had been set in motion, not just to destroy them, but to erase everything, everything that had once been alive. It was as though the land had turned against them, a living, breathing thing that had been waiting for this moment to come. The survivors fought, but each shot, each swing of a weapon, seemed like it was only pushing them closer to their inevitable end. The creatures didn't stop, didn't waver. They kept coming, no matter how many fell. One by one, the survivors began to fall. The first to go was Sarah, a mother who had been holding on to the hope that she could save her child, the last living part of her family. She fought valiantly, knocking down one zombie after another. But there were too many. A creature lunged at her from behind, sinking its teeth into her shoulder, and she screamed as the life. The others tried to help, but they were overwhelmed. The undead were everywhere, surrounding them, closing in with every passing second. John, a former farmer who had been a strong man in his prime, fought with a ferocity that none of them had expected. He swung his axe in wide arcs, taking down several zombies at once. But he, too, was overwhelmed. One of the creatures bit down on his leg, and as he fell, the rest of them descended upon him. Samantha, the town's teacher, fought until the very end, refusing to let the nightmare claim her without a fight. She used every ounce of her strength to push the undead back, but they were relentless. With each passing moment, the survivors grew weaker, more desperate. But they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Even as they knew their lives were slipping away, they fought on. They had no choice. As the creatures closed in on the last of them, the town fell completely silent. The battle
had ended, and the undead stood victorious. The survivors were gone. The last of the living had been consumed, dragged down into the very earth that had cursed them. The town of Iowa, once a place full of life, now lay in ruins, its streets filled with the remnants of the battle, a ghost town swallowed by the curse that had been unleashed. The undead still shuffled through the streets, dragging themselves through the broken buildings, looking for anything that could be consumed. But in the end, it didn't matter. The curse had claimed everything.
No one knew if the creatures were really gone. Some believed they had been wiped out in the battle. Others feared that they would return. There were no guarantees, but for the survivors, if any of them had managed to escape, the truth was clear. Iowa's deepest fear was no longer just a story. It was real, and it couldn't be stopped. The town had fallen. The curse had done its work, and all that was left was the silence, the emptiness, and the lingering question of whether anyone would ever remember the people who had once lived there, or if the land would erase them entirely, as if they had never existed at all.